Picture this scene unfolding in a crowded high school cafeteria. A 17-year-old girl kneeling on grimy linoleum, surrounded by sneering faces and the cruel laughter of students recording every humiliating second. The star wrestler towers over her, his voice dripping with malice as he demands she lower her face to the filthy floor and lick up the mess he deliberately created. What none of these bullies realized was that this quiet girl had spent the last 6 years mastering an ancient martial art that could turn their world upside down in mere seconds. What happened next would echo through their small Oregon town for years to come, transforming not just the life of one brave teenager, but exposing a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of local government. If you're ready for a story of justice that will leave you cheering and possibly in tears, you've come to exactly the right place. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog rolled lazily across the Cascade foothills as Sarah Chen stepped off the yellow school bus at Westfield High School, her worn canvas backpack slung carefully over one shoulder. At 17, Sarah had perfected the delicate art of moving through the world without leaving ripples. Her straight black hair hung like a curtain around her face, and she favored oversized hoodies that seemed to swallow her petite 5'2" frame. In a school where status was measured by Instagram followers, designer clothes, and weekend party invitations, Sarah existed in the comfortable shadows, content to excel academically while keeping her most remarkable secret hidden from everyone around her. Riverside, Oregon was the kind of place where 3 generations of the same family might attend the same high school, where everyone knew everyone else's business, and where certain last names opened doors while others seemed to close them permanently. The Chen family had arrived in Riverside 8 years ago, when Sarah's father, James, accepted a position teaching advanced mathematics at the high school. Her mother, Grace, worked as a radiology technician at Riverside General Hospital, and together they had built a quiet, stable life in the modest apartment above the tutoring center that James ran after school hours. Sarah navigated the familiar morning chaos of Westfield High with practiced ease, her feet automatically carrying her toward her locker in the science wing. The hallways smelled of industrial cleaner mixed with teenage anxiety, a combination that had become oddly comforting over her 4 years at the school. Students clustered around lockers and classroom doorways, sharing weekend gossip and frantically comparing notes for first-period tests. Sarah moved through these social clusters like water flowing around stones, acknowledged by a few classmates but largely invisible to the broader ecosystem of high school politics. What none of her classmates knew, what even her parents didn't fully understand, was that Sarah Chen spent every afternoon after school in the cramped equipment room behind the gymnasium, learning techniques that would make a special forces operator proud. Coach Amanda Rivera had been teaching Sarah Judo since she was 11 years old, back when Sarah had been getting pushed around by older kids and her parents had asked the PE teacher for advice about building their daughter's confidence. Coach Rivera had seen something special in the quiet girl with the intense, dark eyes and the surprising inner fire that emerged when she was challenged. Amanda had competed in the Olympics 15 years earlier, representing the United States in Judo before a knee injury ended her competitive career and led her to teaching. She recognized in Sarah the same fierce determination that had carried her to the world stage, combined with a natural athleticism and mental discipline that were exceptionally rare. Their training sessions had started as basic self-defense lessons, but it quickly became apparent that Sarah possessed an intuitive understanding of leverage, balance, and timing that couldn't be taught. Coach Rivera began introducing more advanced techniques, and Sarah absorbed them like a sponge soaking up water. By the time Sarah turned 15, she was executing throws and submissions that would challenge black belts with decades of experience. The arrangement worked perfectly for both of them. Sarah's parents believed she was simply helping Coach Rivera organize equipment and clean the gym after school, earning a small amount of spending money while staying out of trouble. Coach Rivera listed Sarah as a volunteer assistant, which satisfied the school's insurance requirements and gave them unlimited access to the training space. Sarah's father occasionally worried that his daughter was spending too much time alone, but her grades remained stellar, she never caused problems, and she seemed genuinely happy with her routine. What Sarah's parents didn't know was that their daughter was preparing for the regional judo championships, a competition that could potentially lead to national rankings and college scholarship opportunities. Coach Rivera had been submitting Sarah's competition videos to tournament organizers under a different name, and the response had been overwhelming. Coaches from major universities had begun making discreet inquiries about the mysterious young judoka whose technique videos were circulating among serious practitioners. Sarah's training regimen was intense and unforgiving. Every afternoon, she spent 2 hours working on technique, conditioning, and mental preparation. Coach Rivera had taught her not just the physical aspects of judo, but the philosophy behind the martial art. Judo was about using an opponent's strength and aggression against them, about finding the perfect moment to act, and about maintaining absolute control over one's emotions and reactions, even in the most stressful situations. The mental discipline had served Sarah well beyond the training mat. She had learned to read people's intentions through their body language and tone of voice, to remain calm under pressure, and to calculate multiple response options in high-stress situations. These skills had helped her navigate the complex social dynamics of high school, avoiding conflicts and staying below the radar of students who might see her as an easy target. Sarah's home life provided a stark contrast to the privilege and entitlement that characterized many of her classmates' families. The Chen family lived modestly, carefully managing their finances and emphasizing education, hard work, and personal responsibility. Dinner conversations often revolved around current events, academic challenges, and plans for Sarah's college applications. Her parents had immigrated from Taiwan before Sarah was born, and they carried with them a deep appreciation for educational opportunities and a fierce determination to build a better life for their daughter. James Chen taught calculus and advanced placement mathematics at Westfield High, which meant Sarah occasionally encountered him in the hallways during the school day. Their relationship was warm but professional within the school setting, and Sarah appreciated that her father never tried to use his position to give her special advantages or attention. If anything, she sometimes felt that she had to work harder to prove that her academic success was based on merit rather than favoritism. Grace Chen worked long shifts at the hospital, often arriving home exhausted but always making time to help Sarah with college applications and scholarship essays. Sarah's mother had a quiet strength and an unwavering ethical compass that had shaped Sarah's own sense of right and wrong. Grace had taught her daughter that standing up for what was right was always worth the personal cost, even when it seemed easier to look the other way. Sarah's only real friend at school was Lily Park, a fellow senior who shared her love of academic achievement and her tendency to avoid the drama that seemed to follow the more popular students. Lily was the daughter of Korean immigrants who owned a successful restaurant in downtown Riverside, and she understood the pressure of being caught between two cultures while trying to excel in an environment where she sometimes felt like an outsider. Lily and Sarah had bonded over their shared experience of being academically focused Asian American students in a predominantly white school district. They studied together, shared college preparation strategies, and provided each other with emotional support when the isolation of high school social dynamics became overwhelming. Lily was one of the few people who knew that Sarah spent her afternoons with Coach Rivera, though even she didn't understand the true extent of Sarah's martial arts training. The social hierarchy at Westfield High was as rigid and unforgiving as any medieval caste system. At the top sat the children of Riverside's most prominent families, students whose last names appeared on street signs, building dedications, and scholarship foundations. These students moved through the school with the confidence that came from knowing their family's influence would protect them from serious consequences and open doors that remained closed to others. Derek Wilson occupied the absolute pinnacle of this social pyramid. As the son of Mayor Robert Wilson, Derek had grown up understanding that rules applied differently to him than they did to everyone else. He was also the star of the wrestling team, with multiple state championship titles and scholarship offers from Division I universities. Derek possessed the kind of classical good looks and natural charisma that made adults trust him automatically and gave him tremendous influence over his peers. But Sarah had observed Derek carefully over the years, and she had seen the cruelty that he kept hidden behind his charming, public persona. She had witnessed him humiliating younger students when he thought no teachers were watching, making inappropriate comments to girls who couldn't fight back effectively, and using his status to escape consequences for behavior that would have resulted in serious punishment for anyone else. Derek's inner circle consisted of Marcus Thompson and Kyle Rodriguez, both athletes who served as his enforcers and enablers. Marcus was the football team captain, built like a linebacker and possessed of the kind of aggressive personality that made him perfect for intimidating anyone who might challenge Derek's authority. Kyle was quieter but more dangerous, the kind of person who would follow orders without question and who seemed to enjoy the fear that his presence generated in other students. Together, the three of them formed an unofficial ruling council that controlled much of the social dynamics at Westfield High. They decided which students were acceptable targets for harassment, which parties were worth attending, and which teachers deserved respect versus those who could be safely ignored or undermined. Their influence extended beyond the school grounds, as their families' connections in the community meant that their approval or disapproval could affect students' part-time job opportunities, college recommendation letters, and social standing throughout Riverside. Sarah had managed to avoid their attention for nearly 4 years by being utterly unremarkable in every visible way. She kept her grades high, but not so exceptional that teachers called attention to her achievements in class. She participated in academic clubs but avoided leadership positions that might put her in the spotlight. She dressed in a way that was neat and appropriate, but never fashionable enough to attract notice, and she had cultivated the ability to move through crowded spaces without drawing attention to herself. This strategy had served her well throughout her high school career, allowing her to focus on her studies and her secret training, without the complications that came with being noticed by the wrong people. Sarah was months away from graduation, with early acceptance letters from several prestigious universities already secured, and she had begun to believe. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. That she might make it through her senior year without any serious complications. What Sarah didn't realize was that her very success at remaining invisible had begun to attract a different kind of attention. Derek Wilson had started to notice the quiet girl who seemed to glide through the school without ever engaging with the social dynamics that consumed most of their classmates. There was something about Sarah's self-contained confidence that intrigued him, and something about her refusal to acknowledge his status that he found simultaneously fascinating and infuriating. Sarah's morning routine was precise and efficient, reflecting the discipline that Coach Rivera had instilled in her over years of training. She arrived at school exactly 15 minutes before the first bell, retrieved her materials from her locker with minimal wasted motion, and made her way to her first class with enough time to review her notes before the lesson began. This routine had served her well for years, providing structure and predictability in an environment that could be chaotic and unpredictable. As Sarah organized her materials for first-period chemistry, she felt the familiar sense of calm focus that came from being prepared and in control of her immediate environment. She had no way of knowing that this would be the last morning when she could move through Westfield High as an invisible observer, that forces were already in motion that would transform her from a quiet background figure into the center of a storm that would reshape not just her own life, but the entire power structure of her school and community. The first bell rang, its sharp sound cutting through the morning chatter and signaling the official start of another day at Westfield High School. Sarah gathered her books and headed toward the chemistry lab, her thoughts focused on the upcoming exam and her plans for the afternoon training session with Coach Rivera. She had no way of anticipating that within a few hours, everything she had worked to build and protect would be tested in ways she had never imagined, and that her years of secret preparation were about to be put to their ultimate test. The chemistry lab buzzed with nervous energy as students filed in for first period, the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread that accompanied any class where Mrs. Henderson was known to spring pop quizzes without warning. Sarah slipped into her usual seat in the third row, close enough to demonstrate engagement, but far enough back to avoid unwanted attention from classmates who might want to copy her work. She had learned through careful observation that the sweet spot in any classroom was the zone where dedicated students sat, visible to teachers as serious learners, but invisible to the social dynamics that played out in the back rows. Mrs. Henderson launched into a review of molecular structures with the kind of enthusiasm that only a true chemistry lover could muster at 8 in the morning. Sarah found herself genuinely engaged with the material, her mind working through the complex relationships between atoms and bonds while simultaneously maintaining awareness of the classroom dynamics around her. This dual focus had become second nature through years of training with Coach Rivera, who had taught her that true awareness meant processing multiple streams of information simultaneously. 3 seats over, Derek Wilson slouched in his chair with the casual arrogance of someone who had never doubted that his charm and family connections would carry him through any academic challenges. He was whispering something to Marcus Thompson that made both boys snicker, their attention clearly focused on something other than covalent bonds and electron sharing. Sarah noticed that Mrs. Henderson glanced their way several times but never directly addressed their disruptive behavior, a pattern that had repeated itself in every class Sarah shared with Derek over the years. The unspoken understanding seemed to be that certain students were held to different standards, that the sons and daughters of Riverside's most prominent families deserved latitude that wouldn't be extended to others. Sarah had watched this dynamic play out countless times, seeing how teachers who would strictly enforce rules for most students would find excuses and exceptions when dealing with the children of school board members, major donors, or powerful community figures. When the period ended, Sarah gathered her materials with the efficient movements that had become automatic after years of practice. She had exactly 4 minutes to reach her AP English classroom on the second floor, time enough to stop at her locker and mentally transition to the day's discussion of Shakespearean themes. As she moved through the crowded hallway, Sarah practiced the situational awareness techniques that Coach Rivera had drilled into her, automatically cataloging exit routes, potential obstacles, and the emotional tenor of the students around her. AP English with Mr. Morrison was Sarah's favorite class, partly because of the challenging material, and partly because the academic focus created an environment where her natural intellectual abilities were valued rather than seen as threatening. Mr. Morrison had a gift for creating discussions that pushed students to think critically and express their ideas clearly, and Sarah found herself looking forward to the daily exploration of complex literary themes. Lily Park was already seated when Sarah arrived, and her friend's subtle nod confirmed that she had completed the assigned reading and was prepared for what promised to be an intensive discussion of power dynamics in Macbeth. The irony of studying corruption and the abuse of authority in literature, while living with similar dynamics in their own school environment, was not lost on either of them, though they had learned to keep such observations to themselves. Mr. Morrison began the class by posing a question that immediately captured Sarah's attention. He asked the students to consider whether Lady Macbeth's manipulation of her husband represented strength or weakness, and whether the pursuit of power inevitably corrupted those who sought it. Sarah found herself thinking not just about the fictional characters, but about the real-world examples of power and corruption that she observed every day in the hallways of Westfield High. When Mr. Morrison called on her to share her thoughts, Sarah spoke carefully about the way that unchecked authority could create environments where abuse became normalized, and victims were silenced through fear and intimidation. She watched Derek Wilson's expression as she spoke, noting the way his jaw tightened when she discussed the responsibility of bystanders to speak up against injustice, even when doing so carried personal risk. The discussion continued for the full period, with students offering increasingly sophisticated analyses of the themes Shakespeare had embedded in his exploration of political corruption. Sarah contributed several times, her insights drawing appreciative nods from Mr. Morrison and engaged responses from her classmates. For 50 minutes, she existed in an environment where her intelligence was an asset rather than something to be hidden, where thoughtful analysis was rewarded rather than seen as showing off. As the class ended, Mr. Morrison approached Sarah's desk with a recommendation form for a prestigious summer literary program at the University of Oregon. He spoke quietly about her exceptional analytical skills and suggested that the program could provide valuable preparation for her college career while connecting her with other serious scholars from across the Pacific Northwest. Sarah accepted the form gratefully, understanding that such opportunities were rare and valuable, but also recognizing that participating would mean sacrificing some of her training time with Coach Rivera. The morning continued with calculus, where Sarah found herself in the unique position of being taught by her own father. James Chen maintained strict professional boundaries during class time, never calling on her more than any other student and certainly never giving her preferential treatment. If anything, Sarah sometimes felt that her father held her to slightly higher standards, expecting her to model the kind of academic engagement and intellectual curiosity that he hoped to inspire in all his students. Today's lesson focused on derivatives and their real-world applications, and Sarah found herself genuinely fascinated by the mathematical relationships that governed everything from population growth to the trajectory of projectiles. Her father had a gift for making abstract concepts concrete and relevant, helping students understand how mathematical principles applied to fields ranging from engineering to economics to biology. During the lesson, Sarah noticed Derek Wilson struggling with concepts that came naturally to her. She had observed over the years that Derek's academic performance was inconsistent, excellent in some areas where his natural intelligence shone through, but weaker in subjects that required sustained effort and discipline. She wondered sometimes whether his academic record would look quite as impressive without the subtle assistance and grade adjustments that seemed to follow him through his high school career. When Mr. Chen posed a particularly challenging problem to the class, Sarah worked through the solution methodically, her training in mental discipline helping her maintain focus even as other students grew frustrated and gave up. The problem required not just mathematical skill but patience and systematic thinking, qualities that her judo training had helped her develop. She completed the solution several minutes before anyone else but waited to raise her hand until a few other students had finished, not wanting to appear to be showing off or seeking special attention from her father. The lunch period arrived with the controlled chaos that characterized every high school cafeteria. Hundreds of teenagers navigating complex social dynamics while consuming questionable food in a space that amplified every conversation into a cacophony of competing voices. Sarah and Lily had established a routine of eating quickly in the cafeteria before retreating to the library for the remainder of the period, finding the quiet environment more conducive to productive conversation and homework completion. Today, however, Lily had been called to the guidance office to discuss her college applications, leaving Sarah to navigate the cafeteria alone. She moved through the lunch line efficiently, selecting a turkey sandwich and an apple before scanning the room for an acceptable place to sit. The social geography of the cafeteria was as clearly defined as any map, with different areas claimed by various cliques and social groups. Sarah typically chose a table near the windows where other academically focused students gathered, a zone that was generally ignored by the more socially prominent groups. Today, however, those tables were full, forcing her to consider alternatives. She finally settled on an empty table near the kitchen area, a location that was less desirable due to the noise and traffic, but offered the advantage of being relatively isolated from the main social dynamics of the room. As Sarah ate her lunch and reviewed notes for her afternoon history test, she became aware of a commotion developing several tables away. Derek Wilson and his friends had cornered a freshman boy who appeared to be on the verge of tears, and their voices were beginning to carry across the cafeteria. Sarah couldn't make out the specific words, but the body language was unmistakable. The older boys were using their size and status to intimidate someone who had no realistic way to defend himself. Sarah watched the scene unfold with growing unease, recognizing the pattern that she had observed numerous times over her years at Westfield High. Derek and his friends would identify a vulnerable target, usually someone younger or smaller or from a family without social connections, and they would systematically humiliate that person until they either left the school or learned to accept their position at the bottom of the social hierarchy. The freshman boy was clearly terrified, his hands shaking as he tried to eat his lunch while the older boys made increasingly aggressive gestures. Other students at nearby tables were watching but pretending not to see, the kind of willful blindness that allowed predatory behavior to continue unchecked. Sarah felt the familiar surge of anger that rose whenever she witnessed injustice, the same feeling that had driven her to excel in her training and to prepare herself for situations exactly like this one. But Sarah also understood the reality of her situation. Intervening would mean exposing herself to Derek's attention and potentially making herself a target for future harassment. She was months away from graduation, with college acceptance letters already secured and a clear path toward the future she had worked so hard to build. Getting involved in someone else's conflict could jeopardize everything she had worked to achieve. Coach Rivera had taught her that the best fights were the ones you never had to have, that avoiding conflict through awareness and strategic thinking was often more effective than physical confrontation. Sarah had spent 4 years successfully implementing this philosophy, keeping her head down and staying out of situations that could derail her carefully planned trajectory toward college and independence. As Sarah wrestled with these competing impulses, the situation at Derek's table continued to escalate. The freshman boy had started to cry, and Derek was now forcing him to stand while making loud comments about his appearance and family background. Marcus Thompson was recording the interaction on his phone, clearly planning to share the humiliation on social media where it would be preserved and amplified for the entertainment of their peers. Sarah felt her training taking over, her body automatically shifting into a state of heightened awareness as she calculated distances, assessed potential threats, and considered response options. Coach Rivera had taught her to trust her instincts in situations like this, to recognize when her intervention might be necessary, regardless of the personal cost. But Sarah also knew that once she revealed her capabilities, there would be no going back to the comfortable anonymity that had protected her throughout high school. The lunch period was drawing to a close, and Sarah knew that whatever was going to happen would need to happen soon. The freshman boy was now openly sobbing, and Derek was clearly enjoying the power he held over someone who couldn't fight back effectively. Other students were beginning to gather around the scene, some recording with their phones and others simply watching with the kind of morbid fascination that seemed to accompany public humiliation. Sarah made her decision with the kind of clarity that came from years of training and mental preparation. She gathered her things and began moving toward the conflict, her mind automatically running through the techniques that Coach Rivera had taught her for de-escalating dangerous situations. She understood that she was about to step across a line that would change her life fundamentally, but she also understood that some situations required action regardless of the personal consequences. As she approached Derek's table, Sarah felt the familiar calm that descended during her training sessions, the state of focused awareness that allowed her to process multiple streams of information while maintaining emotional control. She could see the surprise on Derek's face as she inserted herself into the situation, clearly not expecting the quiet girl from the back of his classes to involve herself in his entertainment. The cafeteria around them seemed to grow quieter as other students sensed that something significant was about to happen. Sarah found herself at the center of attention in a way that she had spent 4 years carefully avoiding, standing between Derek Wilson and his victim, with the weight of hundreds of watching eyes upon her. She understood that this moment would define not just the rest of her senior year, but potentially the trajectory of her entire future. Coach Rivera had always taught her that the most important battles were fought not for personal gain, but to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. As Sarah looked into the frightened eyes of the freshman boy, and then met Derek's surprised and increasingly angry gaze, she realized that all her years of training had been preparing her for exactly this moment, when she would have to choose between her own safety and doing what was right. The decision was made, and there was no turning back now. Derek Wilson stood in the center of the cafeteria like a king surveying his domain, his 6-foot frame radiating the kind of confidence that came from 18 years of never facing real consequences for his actions. Everything about Derek's presence commanded attention, from his perfectly styled blonde hair that caught the fluorescent lights, to the way his leather jacket stretched across shoulders broadened by years of wrestling training. His blue eyes held a calculating intelligence that made him dangerous in ways that went far beyond physical intimidation, and his smile carried just enough charm to disarm adults while concealing the cruelty that his peers knew all too well. The Wilson family name had been synonymous with power in Riverside for 3 generations, each one building upon the influence and wealth accumulated by their predecessors. Derek's great-grandfather had established the first successful lumber mill in the region during the 1940s, transforming vast stretches of Oregon forest into the fortune that would become the foundation of the family's political dynasty. His grandfather had parlayed that wealth into real estate development and political influence, serving multiple terms on the city council before being elected mayor for the first time in the 1970s. Robert Wilson, Derek's father, had inherited not just money but a sophisticated understanding of how power operated in small-town America. He had earned a law degree from the University of Oregon before returning to Riverside to practice family law and eventually run for mayor himself. Robert's political career had been marked by an uncanny ability to maintain support from diverse constituencies, while quietly accumulating unprecedented control over city contracts, development permits, and municipal appointments. The Wilson family's influence extended into every corner of Riverside's civic and business life. They owned significant stakes in the local bank, the largest construction company, and several retail developments that employed hundreds of residents. Their foundation provided scholarships to local students, funded youth sports programs, and supported various charitable initiatives that kept the family name prominently displayed throughout the community. This web of financial relationships and philanthropic activities had created a situation where challenging the Wilson family meant potentially jeopardizing one's livelihood, children's opportunities, or community standing. Derek had grown up understanding that rules were suggestions rather than absolute requirements, that his family's position provided a buffer between his actions and their consequences. As a child, he had watched his father make phone calls that resolved traffic tickets, building code violations, and other minor legal issues with the kind of casual efficiency that made it clear these interventions were routine rather than exceptional. Derek learned early that the right last name could open doors, silence critics, and transform potential problems into forgotten inconveniences. This sense of immunity had shaped Derek's personality in profound ways, creating someone who viewed other people as either useful allies or entertaining diversions, rather than individuals deserving of respect and consideration. He had developed a sophisticated understanding of social dynamics and power relationships, skills that made him exceptionally effective at identifying vulnerable targets and exploiting their weaknesses for his own amusement. Derek's academic record at Westfield High reflected the kind of inconsistent performance that characterized students who knew their futures were secured through connections rather than achievement. He excelled in subjects that interested him, particularly history and social studies, where his natural intelligence and argumentative skills served him well. In more challenging courses like advanced mathematics and sciences, his grades reflected the kind of grade inflation that teachers employed when they understood that failing the mayor's son could have professional consequences. His wrestling career, however, was where Derek's competitive nature and physical gifts truly shone. He had dominated his weight class since freshman year, accumulating state championship titles and setting school records that would likely stand for decades. College recruiters had been visiting Westfield High since Derek's sophomore year, and scholarship offers from Division I universities continued to arrive, despite academic performance that would have disqualified most other student athletes. The wrestling team provided Derek with a perfect vehicle for his need to dominate and control others. The sport's emphasis on individual combat and physical superiority aligned perfectly with his personality, while the team structure gave him a group of loyal followers who admired his success and feared his displeasure. Derek had cultivated relationships with his teammates that went beyond normal friendship, creating bonds of dependence and loyalty that ensured their support for whatever activities he chose to pursue. Marcus Thompson had been Derek's closest ally since middle school, when Derek had intervened to protect Marcus from bullies who were targeting him for his family's financial struggles. Marcus's father had lost his job at the lumber mill during a downturn, and the family had been forced to move into subsidized housing on the outskirts of town. Derek's friendship had provided Marcus with social protection and access to opportunities that would have been impossible otherwise, creating a debt of gratitude that had evolved into unquestioning loyalty. Kyle Rodriguez represented Derek's other type of follower, someone who gravitated toward power and aggression because it made him feel important and feared. Kyle's family had immigrated from Mexico when he was young, and he had struggled with issues of belonging and identity throughout his school years. Derek's acceptance had provided Kyle with a sense of purpose and belonging, but it had also required him to participate in activities that gradually eroded his natural empathy and moral compass. Together, the three boys formed a hierarchy that controlled much of the social atmosphere at Westfield High. Derek's charisma and family connections provided the foundation of their power. Marcus's size and athletic ability served as enforcement when intimidation was required, and Kyle's willingness to follow orders without question made him useful for situations that required plausible deniability. Their influence operated through a combination of reward and punishment that kept most students either seeking their approval or avoiding their attention. Students who aligned themselves with Derek's group gained access to the best parties, the most desirable social connections, and protection from harassment by other students. Those who opposed them or simply failed to show appropriate deference found themselves subjected to increasingly sophisticated forms of psychological and social torment. Derek had refined these tactics over years of practice, developing methods of harassment that were difficult for adults to detect or prove, but devastatingly effective at breaking down his target's confidence and social standing. He understood how to use social media to amplify humiliation, how to manipulate academic and extracurricular opportunities to punish those who defied him, and how to coordinate group harassment campaigns that made his victims feel isolated and helpless. The freshman boy currently cowering at Derek's table represented the kind of target that Derek found most appealing, someone whose vulnerability was apparent but whose family lacked the resources or connections to retaliate effectively. Tommy Martinez was small for his age, academically gifted but socially awkward, and came from a family where both parents worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. He had attracted Derek's attention by scoring higher on a recent history test than Derek himself, a minor academic embarrassment that Derek had decided required correction. Derek's method of dealing with Tommy was calculated to maximize humiliation while minimizing the risk of administrative intervention. He had started with small incidents, casual shoulder bumps in hallways, and disparaging comments delivered just loudly enough for nearby students to hear. These initial provocations had established Tommy as a legitimate target in the eyes of other students, creating an atmosphere where more serious harassment would be seen as natural escalation rather than unprovoked aggression. The current cafeteria incident represented Derek's decision to move beyond subtle intimidation toward more overt displays of dominance. He had deliberately spilled food near Tommy's seat and then demanded that the younger boy clean it up, using language and tone that made it clear this was not a request. When Tommy had hesitated, Derek had escalated the situation by publicly questioning his cleanliness, his family's financial situation, and his right to occupy space in the cafeteria. The performance was being conducted for the benefit of the watching students, many of whom were recording the interaction on their phones for later distribution on social media platforms. Derek understood that public humiliation was more effective than private intimidation because it created lasting documentation of his power and his victims' helplessness. These recorded incidents served as warnings to other potential targets while providing entertainment for students who were grateful not to be in Tommy's position. Principal Morrison's absence from the cafeteria during lunch periods was not accidental, but reflected an administrative strategy of avoiding direct confrontation with situations that might require disciplinary action against influential students. Derek's father had made it clear through various channels that he expected school administrators to handle any issues involving his son with appropriate consideration for the family's position in the community and Derek's bright future prospects. This understanding had created an environment where teachers and administrators had learned to look the other way when Derek's behavior crossed lines that would result in serious consequences for other students. Detention assignments were rare and brief, suspension recommendations somehow got lost in paperwork, and complaints from other students or their families were handled through quiet conversations about the importance of not damaging promising young people's futures over minor misunderstandings. Coach Stevens, who supervised the wrestling team, had developed a particularly close relationship with Derek that went beyond normal coach-athlete dynamics. Derek's success on the wrestling mat brought prestige to the school's athletic program and Coach Stevens' professional reputation, creating incentives for overlooking behavior that might otherwise result in team discipline. Stevens had convinced himself that Derek's aggressive tendencies were simply expressions of the competitive drive that made him successful in wrestling, channeling natural leadership qualities that would serve him well in college and beyond. The town's business and civic leaders had similarly invested in Derek's success, viewing him as a representative of Riverside's next generation of leadership. His combination of athletic achievement, family connections, and natural charisma made him an ideal candidate for the kind of prominent role that would bring positive attention to the community. Local newspaper coverage of Derek's wrestling victories often mentioned his academic achievements and community service activities, creating a public narrative of excellence that would be difficult to challenge without substantial evidence of serious wrongdoing. Derek's understanding of this protective environment had made him increasingly bold in his treatment of fellow students, confident that his actions would be interpreted through the lens of his positive reputation rather than judged on their own merits. He had learned to calculate his harassment campaigns carefully, ensuring that they targeted students whose families lacked the resources or connections to mount effective challenges to his behavior. The psychological impact of Derek's campaigns was often more devastating than any physical violence might have been, as his victims found themselves isolated from potential supporters and facing an opponent whose power seemed absolute and unchangeable. Students who had considered reporting Derek's behavior learned through observation and rumor that such complaints typically resulted in greater harassment rather than protection, creating a climate of fear that ensured most incidents went unreported. Derek's personal philosophy had evolved to view this dynamic as natural and appropriate, a reflection of social hierarchies that rewarded strength, intelligence, and family connections, while punishing weakness and poor decision-making. He genuinely believed that his treatment of students like Tommy Martinez was providing valuable life lessons about power relationships and social reality, preparing them for adult worlds where similar dynamics would operate with even higher stakes. This worldview allowed Derek to maintain his positive self-image while engaging in behavior that would be recognized as cruel and abusive by outside observers. He saw himself as a future leader learning to exercise authority effectively, someone whose natural gifts and family heritage positioned him to guide and shape his community's development. The students he targeted were simply obstacles or entertainment along the path toward his destined role as a prominent citizen and civic leader. As Derek continued his psychological assault on Tommy Martinez, he was entirely focused on the immediate gratification of exercising power and the longer-term goal of reinforcing his dominant position within the school's social hierarchy. He had no way of anticipating that his latest performance was about to be interrupted by someone whose capabilities and determination would challenge every assumption he had made about his own invulnerability and the permanent nature of the power structures he had spent his life learning to exploit. The cafeteria around him buzzed with the kind of excited energy that accompanied public conflict, students sensing drama and positioning themselves to witness whatever entertainment Derek had planned for his victim. The recording phones captured every moment of Tommy's humiliation, preserving it for the viral distribution that would cement Derek's reputation while destroying what remained of his target's social standing and self-respect. Derek Wilson stood at the center of it all, master of his domain and architect of another student's misery, completely unaware that his reign of unchallenged dominance was about to encounter its first real test. Sarah moved through the cafeteria with deliberate steps, her mind processing the scene unfolding before her with the kind of analytical clarity that Coach Rivera had trained into her over countless hours of preparation. The noise and chaos of hundreds of conversations seemed to fade into background static as her focus narrowed to the dynamics playing out at Derek Wilson's table. Every muscle in her body felt coiled and ready, responding to training that had become as natural as breathing. Yet her exterior remained calm and unremarkable as she navigated between tables filled with oblivious students. Tommy Martinez sat frozen in his chair, tears streaming down his face as Derek loomed over him with the predatory satisfaction of someone who had found the perfect victim. The freshman's lunch tray had been knocked to the floor during the initial confrontation, leaving a mess of food and milk spreading across the grimy cafeteria tiles. Derek was now pointing at the spilled contents with theatrical disgust, his voice carrying clearly across the surrounding tables as he demanded that Tommy clean up what was obviously Derek's own handiwork. The circle of students surrounding the incident had grown larger, drawn by the magnetic pull of conflict and the promise of witnessing someone else's humiliation. Cell phones appeared like flowers blooming in spring, their cameras focused on Tommy's tear-stained face and Derek's triumphant expression. Sarah recognized the familiar feeding frenzy that accompanied these public degradation ceremonies, the way that ordinary students transformed into eager spectators when presented with someone else's suffering. Marcus Thompson stood to Derek's right, his massive frame serving as both physical intimidation and crowd control, ensuring that no well-meaning adult could approach without being seen from across the room. Kyle Rodriguez had positioned himself near the kitchen entrance, where he could monitor for approaching faculty members while appearing to be simply getting napkins or condiments. The coordination was subtle but effective, demonstrating the practiced efficiency of a group that had perfected these harassment campaigns through years of repetition. Sarah understood that she was witnessing a carefully orchestrated performance designed to maximize psychological damage while minimizing the risk of meaningful consequences. Derek's choice of location near the kitchen area meant that any spilled food could be attributed to normal cafeteria accidents, while the timing during the peak lunch rush ensured maximum witness participation. The selection of Tommy as a target reflected Derek's skill at identifying students whose families lacked the resources or connections to mount effective challenges to his behavior. As Sarah drew closer to the confrontation, she could hear Derek's words more clearly, and the casual cruelty in his tone made her stomach clench with familiar anger. He was describing in graphic detail what he expected Tommy to do with the spilled food, using language that was designed to be humiliating but not quite explicit enough to constitute clear grounds for discipline. Derek had learned through experience exactly how far he could push before crossing lines that might trigger administrative intervention. The freshman boy's humiliation was being amplified by the reactions of the watching students, some of whom were laughing at Derek's increasingly creative descriptions of the cleanup process he expected. Others looked uncomfortable but made no move to intervene, their faces reflecting the same calculation that had kept Sarah herself paralyzed for the first few minutes of the incident. Getting involved meant making yourself a target, and most students had learned that the safest strategy was to be grateful that someone else had drawn Derek's attention. Sarah felt the weight of every self-defense lesson that Coach Rivera had ever taught her, all the discussions about moral courage and the responsibility that came with possessing the skills to protect others. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, speaking the words that had been passed down through generations of women who had faced impossible choices between personal safety and doing what was right. The training that had started as simple self-defense had evolved into something much more profound, a philosophy of life that demanded action when action was needed most. The internal debate that raged in Sarah's mind reflected the fundamental tension between self-preservation and moral obligation that defined so many crucial moments in human experience. She had spent 4 years successfully navigating the complex social dynamics of Westfield High School precisely because she had learned to avoid situations like this one. Her strategy of remaining invisible had protected her from becoming a target herself while allowing her to focus on the academic achievements that would carry her toward the future she had worked so hard to build. But Sarah also understood that some situations demanded a choice between competing values, between the safety that came from avoiding conflict and the satisfaction that came from standing up for those who couldn't protect themselves. Coach Rivera had taught her that physical skills without moral courage were ultimately meaningless, that the ability to defend oneself carried with it the responsibility to defend others when circumstances required it. The freshman boy's sobs had become more pronounced, his shoulders shaking as Derek's verbal assault continued with increasing creativity and cruelty. Sarah could see that Tommy was approaching the breaking point where public humiliation would transform into lasting psychological damage, the kind of trauma that could follow a student through years of high school and beyond. She had witnessed this transformation before, watching as Derek's previous victims either transferred to other schools or learned to accept their designated roles as objects of ridicule and abuse. Derek's satisfaction with the proceedings was evident in every aspect of his posture and expression, the predatory joy of someone who had found the perfect combination of victim, audience, and circumstance. He was playing to the crowd now, embellishing his demands with theatrical gestures and comedic timing that drew laughter from students who were either genuinely entertained by Tommy's suffering or simply relieved not to be in his position. Sarah's decision crystallized with the sudden clarity that accompanied moments of absolute moral certainty, the recognition that some lines could not be crossed without fundamentally changing who she was as a person. She had spent her entire high school career as an observer rather than a participant, watching injustice unfold while telling herself that intervention would only make things worse. But standing in the cafeteria watching Derek Wilson systematically destroy another human being's dignity, Sarah realized that silence had its own moral weight, that choosing not to act was itself a form of action with consequences she could no longer accept. The approach to Derek's table felt like walking through deep water, each step requiring conscious effort as Sarah fought against instincts that screamed for her to turn around and retreat to safety. Students at nearby tables turned to watch her progress with the kind of fascinated horror that accompanied traffic accidents, sensing that something significant was about to happen but unable to predict exactly what form it would take. Sarah felt their attention like physical pressure, the weight of dozens of pairs of eyes tracking her movement toward a confrontation that would inevitably change everything about her carefully constructed high school existence. Coach Rivera's training took over as Sarah navigated the final few steps toward Derek's table, her body automatically shifting into the ready stance that had become second nature during years of practice. Her breathing deepened and slowed, her heart rate settling into the steady rhythm that accompanied peak performance, and her mind began running through the de-escalation techniques that were always the first option in any conflict situation. Derek noticed her approach when she was still several steps away, his head turning toward her with the lazy confidence of someone who had never encountered effective resistance to his authority. His expression shifted from mild curiosity to amused disdain as he recognized the quiet girl from his advanced classes, someone so unremarkable that he had barely registered her existence despite sharing multiple classrooms over the years. The moment of recognition brought a predatory smile to Derek's lips as he calculated the potential entertainment value of adding another victim to his current performance. Sarah Chen represented everything that Derek found contemptible about his less socially successful classmates, the kind of student who substituted academic achievement for real-world power and influence. Her decision to approach his table struck him as either remarkably brave or incredibly stupid, and either interpretation promised to make the afternoon more interesting. Marcus, Thompson, and Kyle Rodriguez shifted their positions as Sarah drew closer, their body language reflecting the automatic threat assessment that accompanied any potential challenge to their group's activities. Both boys had learned to read social situations with the kind of tactical awareness that came from years of serving as Derek's enforcers, and Sarah's approach triggered their protective instincts, even though she appeared to pose no obvious physical threat. The cafeteria around them seemed to hold its collective breath as Sarah reached the edge of Derek's social territory, that invisible boundary that separated his table from the rest of the room. Students at nearby tables had stopped their conversations to focus on the unfolding drama, their phones already recording in anticipation of whatever entertainment was about to begin. Sarah could feel the weight of their attention like a physical presence. Hundreds of pairs of eyes waiting to see whether she would provide the next chapter in Derek's ongoing demonstration of power. Tommy Martinez looked up at Sarah's approach with the desperate hope of someone who had been drowning, and suddenly spotted a potential rescuer. His eyes were red from crying and his hands shook as he clutched the edge of the table, seeking any source of stability in a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his control. Sarah met his gaze for just a moment, seeing in his expression the same fear and helplessness that she had observed in too many of Derek's previous victims. Derek's voice cut through the ambient noise of the cafeteria as he addressed Sarah directly for the first time in their shared high school experience, his tone carrying the casual arrogance of someone who had never doubted his ability to control any social situation. He asked her what she thought she was doing, whether she had some kind of problem with the way he was handling his business, and whether she understood exactly who she was trying to challenge. The questions were designed to establish dominance while providing Sarah with multiple opportunities to retreat gracefully from a confrontation that she was obviously unprepared to handle. Derek had used similar tactics countless times before, giving potential challengers the chance to back down before he was forced to demonstrate the consequences of defying his authority. His experience suggested that most students would take advantage of these escape routes rather than face the social destruction that came with opposing him directly. Sarah's response surprised Derek with its calm directness, her voice carrying none of the nervousness or deference that he had learned to expect from students in her position. She spoke quietly but clearly, asking Derek to leave Tommy alone and suggesting that whatever point he was trying to make had already been adequately demonstrated. Her tone was respectful but firm, offering Derek the opportunity to end the confrontation without losing face, while making it clear that she was not going to simply walk away. The respectful challenge caught Derek off guard, as most students either submitted immediately to his authority or responded with the kind of defensive anger that justified whatever retaliation he chose to impose. Sarah's approach suggested a confidence that Derek found both intriguing and threatening, the possibility that she might not understand the rules that govern social interactions at Westfield High School. Marcus and Kyle moved closer to Derek's position, their body language shifting from casual observation to active preparation for whatever response their leader might choose. Both boys had participated in enough of these confrontations to recognize the signs that a situation was about to escalate beyond verbal sparring, and they positioned themselves to provide whatever support Derek might require. The circle of watching students tightened around the developing confrontation, their excitement building as they sensed that Sarah's intervention had transformed a routine bullying incident into something potentially more dramatic. Cell phone cameras focused on Sarah's face as students tried to capture her expression, looking for signs of the fear or uncertainty that typically preceded a victim's complete capitulation to Derek's demands. Derek studied Sarah more carefully now, taking in details that he had never bothered to notice during their years of shared classes. Her posture struck him as unusual for someone in her position, displaying the kind of balanced readiness that he associated with serious athletes rather than academic overachievers. Her breathing remained steady despite the obvious stress of the situation, and her eyes maintained direct contact with his own, rather than displaying the submissive body language he had learned to expect from students who challenged his authority. The realization that Sarah might represent a different kind of challenge than Derek had initially anticipated brought a new edge to his voice as he responded to her request. He asked her whether she understood who she was talking to, whether she had any idea what happened to students who interfered in situations that were none of their business, and whether she was prepared to face the consequences of making herself his problem. Sarah's answer came with the same calm certainty that had characterized her initial intervention, acknowledging Derek's reputation while making it clear that she understood exactly what she was risking by involving herself in the situation. Her willingness to accept those risks for the sake of someone she barely knew struck Derek as either admirable stupidity or dangerous confidence, and either interpretation demanded a response that would re-establish his unchallenged dominance. The cafeteria had grown quieter as more students became aware of the confrontation developing near the kitchen area, conversation stopping as attention focused on the unexpected challenge to Derek Wilson's authority. Teachers and staff members remained conspicuously absent from the area, whether by design or coincidence, leaving the students to resolve their conflict without adult intervention. Derek made his decision with the same calculating precision that had guided his harassment campaigns throughout high school, recognizing that Sarah's challenge required a response significant enough to discourage any future interference while providing suitable entertainment for the watching crowd. He gestured toward the spilled food that still covered the floor around Tommy's feet, explaining to Sarah that since she seemed so concerned about the situation, she could take care of the cleanup herself. The demand was delivered with a kind of theatrical flair that Derek had perfected over years of public humiliation campaigns, his voice carrying clearly across the surrounding tables as he outlined exactly what kind of cleanup he expected Sarah to perform. The watching students reacted with a mixture of nervous laughter and shocked silence as they realized that Derek was escalating the confrontation beyond anything they had previously witnessed. Sarah felt the familiar calm descend over her as the situation moved beyond the possibility of peaceful resolution, her training taking over as she prepared for the confrontation that had become inevitable. Years of preparation had led to this moment, and she was finally ready to discover whether all those hours of practice would prove sufficient when everything she had worked to build was on the line. Derek's eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction as he pointed toward the greasy mess of spilled food congealing on the cafeteria floor, his voice rising with theatrical authority as he addressed Sarah directly. The combination of mashed potatoes, chocolate milk, and crushed sandwich remnants had created a nauseating mixture that would be humiliating for anyone to clean up. But Derek's specific instructions made it clear that he expected far more than simple cleanup. His words carried across the now silent cafeteria as he demanded that Sarah get down on her hands and knees and lick the floor clean, his tone suggesting that this was a reasonable request, rather than a degrading assault on human dignity. The watching students reacted with a mixture of shocked gasps and nervous laughter, their phones capturing every word as Derek outlined his expectations with increasing detail and creativity. Marcus Thompson stepped closer to Sarah, his massive frame casting a shadow over her as he positioned himself to physically enforce Derek's demands if necessary. Kyle Rodriguez moved to block potential escape routes, their coordination demonstrating the practiced efficiency of a group that had perfected these humiliation rituals through years of repetition. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of time slowing down that accompanied moments of absolute crisis, her training automatically engaging as her mind processed the rapidly evolving threat situation. Coach Rivera had taught her to recognize the signs that a conflict was moving beyond verbal confrontation toward physical violence, and every indicator she had learned to watch for was now flashing red in her consciousness. Derek's body language had shifted from casual arrogance to predatory aggression, his muscles tensing as he prepared to follow through on his threats. The cafeteria around them had transformed into an arena, with hundreds of students forming concentric circles around the developing confrontation. The energy in the room was electric with anticipation, that particular excitement that accompanied the promise of witnessing something extraordinary and potentially violent. Sarah could hear whispered commentary from nearby students, some expressing disbelief that anyone would dare challenge Derek Wilson directly, others speculating about what form his retaliation would take. Tommy Martinez remained frozen in his chair, his tear-stained face reflecting a mixture of gratitude that someone had tried to help him and terror about what might happen next. Sarah caught his eye for a brief moment, seeing in his expression the same helpless fear that had driven her to intervene in the first place. The knowledge that her decision to get involved had potentially made things worse for the freshman boy added another layer of pressure to an already overwhelming situation. Derek took a step closer to Sarah, his voice dropping to a more intimate register as he explained that her interference had earned her the right to take Tommy's place in the cleanup process. His tone carried the casual confidence of someone who had never encountered effective resistance to his authority, the assumption that Sarah would ultimately submit to his demands once she fully understood the consequences of continued defiance. He gestured again toward the mess on the floor, his movements becoming more theatrical as he played to the watching crowd. Sarah's response came with a calm clarity that surprised even her, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. She told Derek that she wouldn't be licking any floors, that his behavior was unacceptable, and that he needed to leave Tommy alone immediately. Her words carried an authority that seemed incongruous with her small stature and quiet reputation, the kind of confident directness that typically came from people who were accustomed to being obeyed, rather than ignored. The challenge hit Derek like a physical blow, his face flushing red with a combination of embarrassment and rage, as he processed the reality that someone had just refused his direct command in front of hundreds of witnesses. His entire social identity was built on the foundation of absolute authority over his peers, and Sarah's defiance threatened to undermine everything he had worked to establish throughout his high school career. The watching students sensed the shift in dynamics, their excited murmurs reflecting the recognition that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Marcus Thompson moved closer to Sarah's position, clearly preparing to provide whatever physical enforcement Derek might require. His approach was calculated to be intimidating without appearing overtly threatening, the kind of psychological pressure that typically convinced resistant students to reconsider their positions. Marcus had perfected this technique through years of serving as Derek's primary enforcer, using his size and presence to resolve conflicts before they required Derek's direct involvement. Sarah's reaction to Marcus's approach demonstrated the depth of her training in ways that no one in the cafeteria could have anticipated. Instead of backing down or showing signs of fear, she shifted her stance slightly, her weight redistributing in a way that prepared her body for potential combat while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. Her breathing remained controlled and steady, her eyes tracking the movements of all three boys while simultaneously monitoring the crowd for additional threats or potential allies. Coach Rivera had spent countless hours teaching Sarah to read the subtle signs that preceded physical violence, training her to recognize the moment when verbal confrontation would inevitably transition to physical assault. Derek's facial expression had moved beyond mere anger into the kind of cold rage that preceded carefully calculated retaliation, his jaw clenched and his hands slowly curling into fists as he prepared to demonstrate the consequences of challenging his authority. The decision to escalate came suddenly, Derek's patience finally exhausted by Sarah's continued resistance to his demands. He stepped forward aggressively, his hand reaching towards Sarah's shoulder with the clear intention of forcing her down toward the spilled food on the floor. His movement was swift and decisive, the action of someone who had grown tired of verbal sparring and was ready to resolve the conflict through more direct means. Sarah's response was instantaneous and devastating, her years of training condensing into a moment of perfect execution that left everyone in the cafeteria stunned by its speed and precision. As Derek's hand approached her shoulder, Sarah stepped into his movement rather than away from it, her left hand capturing his wrist, while her right hand found the perfect grip on his jacket. The techniques that Coach Rivera had drilled into her through thousands of repetitions took over completely, muscle memory guiding her through a textbook judo throw that used Derek's own momentum and body weight against him. The throw itself was a thing of beauty, a demonstration of leverage and timing that would have impressed Olympic-level competitors. Sarah's pivot was perfectly timed, her hip placement ideal as she used Derek's forward momentum to launch him through the air in a graceful arc that ended with him crashing into the cafeteria floor with a sound that echoed through the suddenly silent room. The impact drove the air from Derek's lungs, leaving him gasping and stunned as he tried to process what had just happened to him. The watching students erupted in shocked exclamations and frantic phone activity, everyone trying to capture video evidence of what they had just witnessed, while simultaneously trying to understand how the quiet girl from their advanced classes had just thrown the star wrestler with apparent ease. The reversal of power dynamics was so complete and unexpected that many observers initially assumed they had misunderstood what they were seeing. Marcus Thompson's reaction was swift but poorly calculated, his loyalty to Derek overriding his tactical judgment as he lunged towards Sarah with the intention of restraining her before she could cause further damage to his friend's reputation. His approach was direct and aggressive, relying on size and strength rather than skill or strategy, exactly the kind of attack that Sarah had trained extensively to counter. Sarah's response to Marcus demonstrated the comprehensive nature of her martial arts education, her training extending far beyond simple throwing techniques to include ground defense, multiple opponent scenarios, and adaptive combat strategies. As Marcus reached for her, Sarah stepped sideways and slightly forward, her hands finding purchase on his extended arm while her legs swept behind his knee. The resulting throw was different from the one she had used on Derek, adapted to Marcus's larger size and different approach angle, but equally effective in its execution. Marcus hit the floor even harder than Derek had, his greater mass making the impact more dramatic and more damaging. The sound of his body striking the linoleum seemed to reverberate through the cafeteria, followed by his groaned expression of pain and confusion as he struggled to understand how someone half his size had managed to put him on his back so decisively. Kyle Rodriguez had been watching the rapid sequence of events with growing alarm, his understanding of the group's invincibility evaporating as he witnessed both of his friends being systematically dismantled by someone they had all dismissed as harmless. His approach towards Sarah was more cautious than Marcus's had been, but his hesitation proved to be his downfall, as it gave Sarah time to properly position herself for his arrival. The third throw was the most technically impressive of the sequence, as Sarah was now dealing with an opponent who had observed her techniques and was presumably attempting to counter them. Kyle's more careful approach required her to create the opening she needed, rather than simply responding to his mistakes, demonstrating advanced tactical thinking and adaptability under pressure. Her feint to the left followed by a rapid direction change caught Kyle completely off guard, and his attempt to grab her resulted in him being launched through the air with even more force than his predecessors. The entire sequence had taken less than 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds had completely transformed the power dynamics of Westfield High School in ways that would reverberate for years to come. 3 of the school's most feared and influential students lay groaning on the cafeteria floor, their carefully cultivated images of invincibility shattered by a girl that most of their classmates had never really noticed before. The aftermath was immediate and chaotic, with students rushing to get better camera angles while others backed away from Sarah, as if she might represent some kind of ongoing threat. The volume in the cafeteria rose to deafening levels as everyone tried to process what they had witnessed, while simultaneously sharing their recordings on social media platforms. Within minutes, videos of the confrontation were spreading across Instagram, TikTok, and Snapchat, accompanied by increasingly hyperbolic descriptions of the quiet girl who had single-handedly defeated the school's most notorious bullies. Sarah stood calmly in the center of the chaos, her breathing still controlled and her posture relaxed, despite having just engaged in physical combat with 3 opponents. The training that Coach Rivera had provided had prepared her not just for the physical aspects of conflict, but for the psychological aftermath, teaching her to maintain emotional equilibrium even in high-stress situations. She looked down at Derek, who was still struggling to catch his breath and clearly trying to process the impossibility of what had just occurred. Derek's expression as he looked up at Sarah was a mixture of pain, embarrassment, and genuine fear, emotions that he had probably never experienced simultaneously in his entire privileged life. The realization that he had just been publicly humiliated by someone he had dismissed as powerless was clearly causing him to reevaluate fundamental assumptions about his own invincibility and the natural order of social relationships at Westfield High. Tommy Martinez had watched the entire sequence with wide-eyed amazement, his earlier tears replaced by an expression of gratitude and wonder that someone had not only stood up for him but had done so with such spectacular effectiveness. The freshman boy's transformation from terrified victim to grateful witness represented the kind of psychological healing that could only come from seeing justice delivered with decisive force. The sound of adult voices approaching the cafeteria finally penetrated the chaos, as teachers and administrators responded to reports of some kind of major incident during lunch period. Principal Morrison arrived first, her expression shifting from routine concern to shock, as she took in the scene of 3 popular male students lying on the floor while a small Asian girl stood calmly nearby, apparently uninjured and completely composed. Coach Rivera appeared in the cafeteria entrance just moments after Principal Morrison, her eyes immediately finding Sarah and conducting a rapid assessment to ensure her student was unharmed. The pride and concern battling in Coach Rivera's expression reflected the complex emotions of a mentor who had spent years preparing her student for exactly this kind of situation, while hoping it would never arise. The explanations that followed were complicated by the fact that dozens of students had recorded different portions of the incident from various angles, creating a comprehensive video record that made it impossible for anyone to misrepresent what had actually occurred. The footage clearly showed Derek's initial aggression toward Tommy, Sarah's attempt at peaceful intervention, Derek's escalation to physical assault, and Sarah's defensive response that had resulted in all 3 boys ending up on the floor. Principal Morrison found herself in the unprecedented position of dealing with a situation where the school's most influential students had been definitively defeated by someone who had previously existed completely outside the normal disciplinary framework. Her initial instinct was to find some way to frame the incident that would minimize damage to Derek's reputation and future prospects. But the video evidence made it impossible to construct any narrative that didn't acknowledge his role as the primary aggressor. Derek's father, Mayor Robert Wilson, arrived at the school within an hour of the incident, his presence accompanied by the kind of barely controlled fury that suggested he was prepared to use every tool at his disposal to protect his son's reputation and future. His meeting with Principal Morrison was conducted behind closed doors, but the raised voices that occasionally leaked into the hallway suggested that the conversation was not proceeding according to his expectations. The viral spread of the cafeteria videos had created a public relations nightmare that even the Wilson family's considerable influence would struggle to contain. The footage was being shared and reshared across social media platforms faster than it could be taken down, accompanied by commentary that ranged from celebrations of justice to detailed analysis of Sarah's judo techniques. News outlets in Portland had picked up the story within hours, and reporters were already calling the school seeking interviews and additional information. Sarah's parents received a call from the school requesting their immediate presence for a conference about their daughter's involvement in a serious incident during lunch period. Grace and James Chen arrived at Westfield High with the kind of parental anxiety that accompanied any unexpected school contact, completely unprepared for the news that their quiet, studious daughter had just become the center of a viral social media phenomenon. The meeting that followed was unlike anything in Principal Morrison's professional experience, as she struggled to explain to Sarah's parents how their daughter had managed to single-handedly defeat 3 much larger male students in what was being described as the most one-sided fight in the school's history. The video evidence made it impossible to deny what had occurred, but the implications were staggering for everyone involved. Coach Rivera's presence in the meeting added another layer of complexity, as her role in Sarah's martial arts training became impossible to conceal once the extent of Sarah's skills became apparent. The revelation that Sarah had been training in judo for years under the supervision of a former Olympic competitor transformed the incident from a lucky defensive action into evidence of serious martial arts expertise that had been deliberately concealed from school administrators. The legal implications of the situation became apparent as lawyers representing both families began arriving at the school, each seeking to protect their clients' interests in what was clearly going to become a complicated and highly publicized case. Derek's injuries, while not serious, were well documented through medical examination, while Sarah's complete lack of injuries supported her claim of acting in self-defense against multiple attackers. The student body's reaction to the incident was immediate and dramatic, with Sarah's status transforming overnight from invisible academic achiever to legendary figure whose actions had fundamentally altered the school's social dynamics. Students who had previously never spoken to her sought her out to express admiration and gratitude, many sharing their own stories of harassment and abuse at the hands of Derek and his friends. The ripple effects extended far beyond Westfield High School, as the viral videos drew attention to broader issues of bullying, privilege, and institutional protection of wealthy and connected students. Education officials at the state level began asking questions about how the situation had been allowed to develop and what oversight mechanisms had failed to prevent Derek's pattern of abusive behavior from continuing unchecked. Derek himself faced consequences that his family's influence proved unable to mitigate, as the video evidence made it impossible to construct any defense that didn't acknowledge his role as the primary aggressor in the incident. His wrestling scholarship offers were withdrawn as university coaches decided that the negative publicity outweighed any athletic benefits he might provide to their programs. The transformation of Westfield High School's culture was gradual but unmistakable, as students who had previously suffered in silence began reporting incidents of harassment and abuse that had been ignored or covered up by administrators, more concerned with protecting the school's reputation than ensuring student safety. Sarah's actions had demonstrated that even the most powerful bullies could be held accountable, creating a new atmosphere where victims felt empowered to speak up rather than simply endure. Sarah's own journey through the aftermath of the incident was complicated by the sudden attention and expectations that accompanied her newfound status as a symbol of resistance against injustice. The quiet student who had preferred to remain invisible found herself thrust into a spotlight that was both empowering and overwhelming, forced to navigate interviews, legal proceedings, and social dynamics that she had never anticipated facing. Coach Rivera's role in Sarah's development became a source of pride rather than secrecy, as the effectiveness of her training methods drew attention from martial arts instructors and educational professionals across the region. The partnership between coach and student, that had developed in secret over 6 years, became a model for other schools seeking to provide their students with both physical skills and moral courage. The legal resolution of the incident established important precedents about self-defense rights for students and the responsibilities of schools to protect vulnerable populations from systematic harassment. Sarah's actions were officially classified as justifiable self-defense, while Derek faced consequences that included suspension, mandatory counseling, and community service focused on understanding the impact of bullying on victims. Tommy Martinez, whose original victimization had triggered the entire sequence of events, experienced his own transformation as he found himself supported by a community that had finally acknowledged the reality of Derek's abusive behavior. The freshman boy's recovery from his trauma was aided by the knowledge that someone had been willing to risk everything to protect him, providing a foundation of hope and trust that would serve him well throughout the remainder of his high school career. The broader community of Riverside was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about privilege, power, and the ways in which institutional structures had protected abusive behavior while silencing victims. The Wilson family's political influence, which had seemed absolute for decades, began to crumble as voters and community leaders recognized the corruption that had allowed Derek's behavior to continue unchecked. Sarah's college applications took on new dimensions as admissions officers learned about her role in challenging systemic injustice and protecting vulnerable students from abuse. Universities that had already accepted her based on academic merit found themselves even more eager to enroll a student whose moral courage had been demonstrated under the most challenging circumstances. Years later, as Sarah pursued her career in civil rights law, she would look back on the cafeteria incident as the moment when she truly understood the power of individual action to create systemic change. The skills that Coach Rivera had taught her had served their purpose not just in protecting her physically, but in demonstrating that justice was possible even when institutional power seemed aligned against it. The legacy of those 30 seconds in the Westfield High cafeteria continued to influence the school's culture long after Sarah graduated, as each new generation of students learned the story of the quiet girl who had refused to accept injustice and had possessed both the skills and the courage to do something about it. Her example inspired countless other students to stand up for themselves and others, creating a lasting transformation that went far beyond any individual incident. Derek Wilson's own journey through the consequences of his actions eventually led to genuine reflection and change, as the shock of his public defeat forced him to confront the reality of his behavior and its impact on others. The humiliation he experienced, while painful, ultimately served as the catalyst for personal growth that his previous life of unchecked privilege had never provided. The story became a testament to the power of preparation meeting opportunity, of years of disciplined training creating the capability to act decisively when action was most needed. Sarah's example demonstrated that even the most entrenched systems of power and abuse could be challenged by individuals who possessed the right combination of skills, courage, and moral clarity. The cafeteria at Westfield High School was eventually renovated, but students continued to point out the exact spot where Derek Wilson had landed when Sarah's judo throw ended his reign of terror. The location became an unofficial memorial to the idea that bullies could be defeated, that victims could be protected, and that sometimes one person's courage was enough to change everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.